From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
Pope Francis issues a new exhortation on holiness with an appeal for Catholics not to fear becoming saints. This week on Register Radio, we talk to J.D. Flynn, editor-in-chief of the Catholic News Agency, for reaction from around the world and the Church. I'm Jeanette DeMello, editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register and co-host of Register Radio, and I'm joined by Matthew Bunson, the Register's senior editor and co-host of Register Radio. Matthew, welcome. Great to be with you, as always. So, Matthew, last week we marked the 2-year anniversary of the release of Pope Francis's Amoris Leatitia, and later in the show, we're going to continue in that vein, talking with Dr. Christian Brugger, a moral theologian who has grave concerns about how some are interpreting that document. But first, we are turning to Gaudete et Exultate, the Holy Father's call to holiness in the world, in today's world. So that's the document on holiness that was issued earlier in the week. And of course, joining us is J.D. Flynn. Welcome.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
So, J.D., it's been a busy week with lots of reactions over this document, but you were pretty quick to respond in the midst of many voices. So what did you have to say when this document first came out?
Well, Jeanette, I read the document, and I guess whatever one thinks of it is an unpopular opinion in some circle, but I read the document and I liked it. I thought it was what the Pope said he wanted it to be. He said, "My modest goal is to repropose the call to holiness in a practical way for our own time. The Lord has chosen each one of us to be holy and blameless before Him in love." And then he talked about the ways in which we're called to holiness, the ways in which we can understand that call to holiness. He talked about the Beatitudes, the ways in which we can try to embody the Beatitudes in our own lives. He talks about works of mercy. And he talks about some of the attitudes and challenges that he sees to growth in holiness for Catholics, for those who are active in the life of the Church. And not every part of it resonated with me. Not every part of it did I think was immediately relevant to me. But there were parts of it that I thought were relevant to me, parts of it that I thought were speaking to me. It was an exhortation. The document is an apostolic exhortation. That means that it's meant to exhort us, to call us to something. And I took it as it was written, as a call to holiness.
Sure.
But, you know, what happened with the document, as so often happens with anything Pope Francis does, is that it was so quickly sort of interpreted in ways that would allow people to entrench themselves in the positions that they've taken in the sort of inter-ecclesial cultural war that we're having. And so many people who have had criticisms of Pope Francis in the past, criticisms that I sympathize with, or at times understand, criticisms of Amoris Leatitia that I agree with, but many of the people who have had criticisms of Pope Francis jumped onto sections of the document that talked about rigorism, or the Pope says a punctilious, I can't even pronounce it, but an overly exacting sort of sense about liturgy and other things, and they jumped onto those things, and they felt that they were attacks by the Pope on theologians, or people who care about doctrine, or people who have raised questions about Amoris Leatitia, or people who care about liturgy, and so defenses were raised quickly, and criticism of the Holy Father came out. On the other side, some of the things that the Pope said about politics, about the importance of consistently upholding the dignity of the human person, were immediately jumped on as validation of certain ecclesial perspectives, or criticism of pro-lifers, or criticism of conservatives. And so it seemed to me that what was happening very quickly is people were picking and choosing pieces they liked or didn't like, and then using them either to complain about the Pope or to complain about fellow Catholics. And there are parts of the document that, are bumpy, or raise questions, or are not as clear as they could be, which is often the case with what Pope Francis writes. But I just wrote a little piece that said, if the first thing we're doing with something that's intended to exhort us is using it to exhort other people, or taking issue with what the Pope has to say, then we've lost the sense of sort of filial obedience and filial piety that allows the Vicar of Christ to call us to holiness.
Of course, and you're talking about the Holy Father. I mean, you use that term, right. And we tend to use that. Practicing Catholics, that's the term we first go to when we speak about Pope Francis, is the Holy Father. And so we owe it to him to have at least first receive this as something from a father. And so the title of your commentary was Reading Pope Francis in Love, because he wrote in love is what the point you make. And sometimes love is tough, and sometimes in love we have to say things that isn't always accepted easily. So I got what you were saying, and actually your commentary helped me a little bit, because as I was plugging through the document, I could feel my critical sense, and coming and knowing exactly how it would be taken by certain factions within the church. So I think your article did serve a very good point. I want to bring Matthew in for a minute here, because Matthew, we've talked in some of our discussions this week about the fact that there's not a lot that's new here in this document.
No, that's exactly right. And what makes this document so interesting is that it is something of a distillation of his previous themes. And in that sense, and one of the things that some analysts have noted, is that there's really nothing new here. You could call this the greatest hits of Pope Francis. And yet he's stringing together a lot of the themes that he's been developing over the last 5 years. And for those of us who followed Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a lot of the themes that he's been talking about for a very long time, dating all the way back to his time in Buenos Aires. I think of parousia, for example, the idea also of the neo-Gnosticism and neo-Pelagianism, something that he's been talking about for a while, as well as his comments regarding the devil and discernment. So all of these we've seen before. And this is all now put helpfully, I think, into one document where he ties it all together under this important theme, as J.D. notes in his great commentary, on love.
Right. Is there anything new in this? Can you sense anything new in what he's putting out there?
Personally, most of what we've seen, like I said, we've seen before. What I do find interesting is, again, that focus that he does have on the Beatitudes. And I think he's helping us to explore the Beatitudes in a new way with this very targeted idea of helping us to be holy. And then, of course, the virtues that we need to perfect in our own lives. Yeah.
What about you, J.D.? Did you sense this as just kind of the same old stuff from Pope Francis, the same drumbeat, or did you sense something new?
Well, I like that Matthew called it the greatest hits, because as I was reading it, I had the same feeling I had when first listening to some of those early tracks of Pope Francis, right? So some of the themes that he touched on early in his pontificate,
the daily homilies,
yeah, right, and things from Evangelii Gaudium, things that really resonated, I think, with a lot of people, and I think have been. The pontificate of Pope Francis has become the subject of so much debate, and there has been so much division about how people are taking things, and so much of that, of course, centers around Amoris Leatitia, that I myself even have, in some ways, forgotten about some of the themes that the Pope was talking about, continues to talk about, that were really inspiring or convicting. I love this section. It's not new, but it was beautiful, about Jesus asking his disciples to pay attention to details, to the little details in people's lives, the little things that we can notice and then respond in love. And those things, no, I don't think there's anything innovative here in terms of what Pope Francis has talked about. But I was glad to be able to return to some themes that I have forgotten about in the course of this pontificate, or perhaps I have at times grown cynical because of so much of the debate about Amoris and other things, that this. In many ways, it was nice to bring those early tracks out and look at them again.
Well, it's funny because we're at the place now in a lot of ways that you've been touching on, the sort of the division and polarization, that the Holy Father calls on all of us to be holy, and people get mad at him.
I know.
Exactly. How dare he? I mean, that's the response. Or if it's not how dare he say this or that, it's yes, I'm so glad that he's finally putting people I disagree with in their place. And neither of those things are the right attitude. What I've tried to tell people, a lot of people over the past few days have raised things to me that they don't think the Pope is being fair, or they think that the Pope is creating straw men or making kind of unfair characterizations. And I've said, look, the thing about an exhortation is you take it and you reflect on it in conscience, and if in conscience you don't think that what the Pope is saying applies to you, then you don't need to be exhorted by that piece of it. You need to be exhorted by another piece of it. But I don't think it's a charitable read to sort of be looking at who is the Pope targeting here and is that fair or not. And I don't think it's a spiritually helpful read either.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I really enjoyed, I used the chapter on the Beatitudes as an examination of conscience. And it's he almost wrote it in that way where you have to ask yourself, am I showing Christ in this way? JD, we don't have much time, but you've pointed to just how hot the environment is. How do we deal with this? How do we get out of such a polarized situation as Catholics? I mean, we fall into it as media. So what advice do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the first place we need to be praying for one another, and praying for people, and especially people in the church with whom we disagree. We need to be examining our own consciences for places where our pride or our frustration or our cynicism has taken root. And then there's a great benefit to being able to talk with people with whom we disagree in a respectful way and really unpack some of the things the Pope is saying. There's so much bad characterization. CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post and virtually every secular media outlet I looked at zeroed in on the political sections of this, the sections that talk about policy, and they got it wrong. They misunderstood what the Pope was saying. So I think in the first place, just reading what's actually being said and seeing, okay, there's some consistency here to what the Holy Father's predecessors have said and something worth saying here, and also seeing what's not being said, and then talking with people about how we can put some of these things he's calling us to do into action.
Well, JD, thanks so much for joining us. You can check out JD's work at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to talk to you again soon. When we come back,
glad to be with you. Thanks, guys.
When we come back, Matthew and I will continue our ongoing conversation about Amoris Leatitia. This is Register Radio. More when we return.
Father Wade Menezes talks about the National Catholic Register.
As the National Catholic Register celebrates its 90th anniversary, I think that says a lot about the publication. It works. It's solidly Catholic. It presents the teachings of the Church unabashedly so, and also guides its readers to be even more solidly Catholic themselves. One of the major effects that I think the Register has on its readers is that it elevates the intellect. Whether it be a faith item or a news item, it presents the news and the faith item in a very balanced way. One thing that the Register can never be accused of is being too far left or too far right. It is solidly Catholic, right in line with the Chair of Peter, and I think that says a lot about the Register.
For a 6-issue free trial of the National Catholic Register, go to ncregister.com and click on the 6 free issue banner, or call 800-421-3230 for your 6 free issues. And as you await your first issue, enjoy some of our online content.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Jeanette DeMello, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, and I am joined by my co-host, Matthew Bunson. And we are turning our conversation over to Amoris Leatitia again. We've been having so many conversations about Amoris, but last week we started a conversation with Dr. John Grabowski from Catholic University of America, who had a certain perspective on Amoris, and now we are turning to another different perspective on Amoris, and we are joined by Dr. Christian Brugger, a moral theologian who has just written a commentary at ncregister.com on the significant dangers of Amoris Leatitia. So, Dr. Brugger, welcome.
Thank you, Jeanette. I'm happy to be here.
You know, you lay out 4 very major issues regarding the moral theology involved in really the Church's moral framework that were expressed by John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor. And you apply that framework to Amoris. So first of all, let's talk about that framework of moral theology that you and many others have been applying to Amoris Leatitia.
Yes, okay. I would call it the veritatis splendor paradigm, the model of moral reasoning drawn from John Paul II. But it's not drawn from John Paul II. It really was, in Veritatis Splendor, Chapter 2, a recapitulation of what had been systematized by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And that was a way of looking at human action and at the human will which engages in action, and especially with respect to Amoris Leatitia, that there are certain kinds of acts that are never compatible with human well-being, that the will can never choose and adopt without doing something harmful to both itself, that is the person who wills it, as well as to those upon whom the actions are directed. And Veritatis Splendor was written in order to affirm these kinds of actions, and they primarily are the actions that are ruled out in the 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th, 9th and 10th commandments of the Decalogue, killing and adultery and lying, those sorts of things. And John Paul II criticized theories at the time. He wrote the encyclical in 1993 because there were significant threats to Catholic moral reasoning at the time arising from within the Church. And the biggest threat was a form of reasoning called proportionalism, which said that if the circumstances are right and the situation is complex enough, then certain exceptions can be made to these general rules. And the moral norms that John Paul II spoke about were called rules by the proportionalists. Mm-hmm. And the Pope came back and said, no, that's a flawed notion of human action. The notion of conscience that justifies that kind of reasoning is flawed. And these theories can't be considered to be faithful Catholic theories of moral reasoning. And so that is primarily the perspective that I was coming into in reading Amoris Leatitia.
And so what I guess I can see just from that explanation of proportionalism how Amoris Leatitia has gotten into that. Obviously, we are looking at circumstances that some are saying make it possible for someone who has not had an annulment and who has gotten remarried to receive communion. Is that the application or the contradiction to in terms of proportionalism that we feel is being promoted in Amoris Leatitia?
Yes, it was the first indication that something problematic was going on in Chapter 8 of Amoris Leatitia, which laid out an analysis that at the time was kind of confusing, and most people who read it weren't quite sure what was being said. But it was quickly interpreted by bishops' conferences around the world, from Malta down to Argentina, as saying that civilly remarried, unannulled Catholics could remain sexually active in their second relationships without a commitment to live chastely with their second partners. And that they didn't need to get an annulment, it was primarily addressing those who couldn't get an annulment, and they could continue living that way and receive Holy Communion, which is a statement that they're in full communion with the Church. So it was very problematic in saying that they could receive full communion, because that was implying that either what they were doing with their sexual behavior wasn't problematic. That is to say, it was marital, but if it was marital, that means their first marriage had been dissolved, and then that would have a problem with the Catholic teaching that marriage is indissoluble. Or it would imply that adultery is sometimes okay, that is to say, sexual activity with someone other than one's valid spouse is sometimes okay. So that was the first indication that there was a very serious problem with Amoris Leatitia. But it's gone on from there, and close collaborators of the Holy Father and interpreters, sort of authoritative interpreters of Amoris Leatitia have gone on to apply it to contraception, and have said that if the circumstances are right, if they're complex enough, then using contraception to render one's sex sterile can be a legitimate expression of responsible parenthood. And it's gone on from there. The question of whether homosexual couples can be blessed by the church under some circumstances. So it's been termed a new way of reasoning about morality, or to use a complex term, a new paradigm that was coined by Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State of the Vatican. A new paradigm. But it's not a new paradigm. It was precisely the paradigm of moral reasoning, singled out, carefully explained, and then rejected by John Paul II in 1993 in Chapter 2 of Veritatis Splendor.
So where do we go from this point, Christian? I mean, you have articulated in several commentaries for us over the last 2 years these points. Many others have done the same. Just last week in Rome, there was a conference of the cardinals who have written the dubia, those who would like to see the Holy Father address the concerns about Amoris Leatitia, and nothing has happened yet. In fact, the opposite has happened. Seems to be the confirmation of those who have taken the Holy Father's message to a more extreme point have been confirmed by him. What do you think is going to happen, and what must happen?
Well, what I think is going to happen, if there's not some sort of intervention, firstly by the Holy Spirit, but perhaps facilitated by his brother bishops who are faithful to the moral teaching of John Paul II in the tradition, and by others, including lay faithful. If something doesn't change, it's going to be applied before long to contraception in an official way, the way it was officially applied to divorce and remarriage. And once that happens, there'll be very serious consequences for the whole edifice of Catholic moral teaching. So you ask, what do we do? And I would say this, that every baptized Christian, every baptized Catholic is authorized by their baptism to be a defender and articulator of the truths of the Christian faith. They have the authority to call their brother Christians, whether they're laymen, clerics, or bishops, to fidelity to the gospel. And every one of us, not just us who are theologians and not just bishops or priests who are clerics, but every baptized Catholic has some obligation now to pray about what does Jesus want me to do in order to protect and to promote the truths of gospel morality. And there's a long tradition of lay people intervening. John Henry Newman, in his great work on consulting the lay faithful in matters of doctrine, speaks about how in the early church it was the bishops and the priests that had abandoned the proper Christology, and that it was the lay people that held on to the truth of divine revelation and gave time for the church under great bishops like Athanasius and Hilary and Eusebius to get their voice, gain their voice, and to defend the faith again. So right now, we can call upon our local bishops to defend the faith of the church, and we can call upon our priests to voice our concerns. We want to do it respectfully because we love the church, and ultimately the church is Jesus' body on earth, and we would never do anything to harm Jesus' body on earth. But we reverence that body, and we want to protect that body. And so I just invite every lay person to pray, what is Jesus inviting you to do at this time in which not the music of the church and the poetry or the cathedrals, but the very belief of the church is being threatened, and those threats are not being clearly redressed by our Holy Father. I don't know why he doesn't address them. I fear that he believes the errors, but that may not be true. But he's not addressing the errors, and so everyone should feel authorized respectfully to speak up.
That's right.
Speak up.
I thank you for those words. I think people do need to hear them, and I can hear the respect in your voice for our Holy Father, but also the urgency. And, you know, a few weeks ago, actually it was a month ago almost now, March 19th, we published a letter from you to the bishops of the world, an open appeal to Catholic bishops of the world. And this was your appeal in conscience, what you felt you needed to do. Can you just describe that very briefly? We're really at the end of the show, but just to let people know about this appeal.
Yes. Well, as a baptized layman, I prayed about it, and I discerned it, and I spoke with bishops and priests and canon lawyers and friends and trusted colleagues and my wife and my children and everybody else for over 2 months. And my conviction was that the best avenue for bringing about change is that a large number of brother bishops who are in a fraternal relationship with our Holy Father would speak up and say to him respectfully, privately, without drawing attention, without humiliating him, to speak to him and to express their concern for the way his teaching is being used to justify actions which the Church has traditionally referred to as always wrong. And I have received an overwhelming number of lay people responding to me saying, thank you, and I'm concerned, and I'm distressed. Not one bishop has replied to me, but that doesn't surprise me because that could be threatening to reply to me. But I pray that they have done what I invited them to do, which was to write to the Holy Father himself or to their apostolic nuncio of their country, and just respectfully to express their concern about the way the new paradigm is being used.
Well, I thank you for your witness and for your wisdom and for sharing that with us so frequently, Dr. Brugger. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you, Jeanette. It was a pleasure.
Remember, for more news, analysis, and commentary, check out the National Catholic Register online at ncregister.com. Thanks for joining us on Register Radio here on EWTN. For Matthew Bunson and our producer, Jeff Burson, I'm Jeanette DeMello. Until next week, God bless you.
For more information about the National Catholic Register and about Register Radio, go to ncregister.com. Podcasts of Register Radio are posted on ncregister.com and on EWTN.com. Join us next week at this time for Register Radio on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.